Our next session will be a discussion focused on some of the systemic issues that affect the agriculture sector, including education, research, extension services, and policies. And moderating this panel is Karen Brooks. Karen is the director of the Consultative Group on International Agricultural Research, where she manages its research program on policies, institutions, and markets. For those of you who may not be familiar with Karen's background, she was a former economist with more than 20 years' experience at the World Bank, where she managed analytical and operational programs in agriculture and rural development in Africa. I will welcome Karen up to the stage, and she can introduce her panel.
Good morning, and thank you very much for that excellent introduction. I want to make one slight correction. I'm introduced as a former economist. I'm actually still an economist. But really, I want to congratulate and thank the MasterCard Foundation for putting together this fantastic summit. And I really want to thank our speaker, Ms. Olopade, who just took us through a really inspiring statement of the ingenuity of informality, and that's so much a part of the agenda that we're talking about for youth, not only in agriculture, but more generally. So I think we're off to a terrific start for our second day, and I'm very pleased to welcome a fantastic panel. Now, one of the things that I like about the way this summit has been put together is that it takes us through the issues from a number of different perspectives. We've looked at the potential for agriculture. We've looked at the actual accomplishments of young people and what they're doing in agriculture. And we've always gone back and forth between the optimism of what can be done, some inspiring stories of what's happening, and then we've kind of flipped over to the realism of, well, it's not that way for everybody. We've had the stories of the diaries, which give us a kind of a cross-section of what people are actually experiencing. And in our debate, again, we went back and forth between the optimism of what can be done and what's actually happening, but then also a view of the systemic constraints to what's holding things back. And so this session is in the category of grounded realism or cautious optimism. We're really going to be focusing on the issues of the constraints. And it's so important for us to do that because when we think of the numbers, the success of the agricultural agenda for young people will not be built by individuals who are able to overcome the constraints. There are wonderful individuals who are doing that, but those will be exceptions unless those constraints can be reduced. So what we're going to be focusing on in this session is understanding what some of those constraints are. What progress are we making in removing those constraints? And how can we do that a bit faster to move forward in recognition that the numbers are such that 10 to 11 million young people each year will be moving into the labor force, and we have to have an environment that makes it possible for them to succeed. So with that, may I introduce our panel, suggest that you come up to the stage. I don't know, should we? Panel members, I think we have our assigned seats, so let's see if we can keep to those. We have, actually, all of us up here are doctors of something or other, so I'll leave off the titles. We have Louise Fox, who is a visiting professor at the University of California at Berkeley. Louise. We have Tom Jane, who is a very distinguished professor at Michigan State University, who has spent quite a bit of time studying and living in Africa. We have Irene Anor-Frempong, who is managing capacity building and the forward progress of the science and technology agenda with the Forum for Agricultural Research in Africa, based in Accra. And we have Sully Gariba, who is Ghana's High Commissioner to Canada. So as you can see, this is a very distinguished panel. And I think we should get right into our topic because we have so much to talk about in relatively little time. We're going to start with Louise Fox, who will lead us through a brief presentation setting out the context for the systemic constraints and the opportunities and progress in removing those constraints that are particularly relevant for African agriculture and including young people in agricultural growth and prosperity. And then we will move to some questions back and forth with the panel. We'll hope to do so with enough time so that we can turn to the audience, because I'm sure that you have many good questions and responses and comments as well. So Louise, may I hand over to you?
With pleasure. Good morning. And I agree with Karen. It was great that MasterCard organized this forum, and I'm pleased to be here. Let's see. I have slides coming. In theory, I have slides coming. There we go. Youth employment. Now, in a way, I did this. This title probably is unnecessary for this group. Listening to the discussions that we had yesterday, I realized that this subtitle is almost passé. But I have to say, when I first started doing my work on youth employment in sub-Saharan Africa 4 years ago, and I started making the case that agriculture was really important, an important sector for youth employment, I have to say I got a lot of blank stares. So I'm thrilled that those blank stares have been filled by activity, innovation, all of the things that our previous speaker just discussed are what makes Africa an exciting and somewhat disruptive indeed place. Okay, so starting right in, I think everybody knows these demographics by now, that Africa's a young continent, it's getting younger. It's the only continent actually where the rural population is growing. Probably you know these numbers by now as well. These numbers show that most Africans work in agriculture. If you look at, let's see, if you look at this number down here, that's the share of the size of the labor force in 2010 in each of these country groupings. So what you see is that most of the labor force in Africa is in the lower income countries and the resource-rich countries. Not very much is in the upper middle income countries. That group is pretty much dominated by South Africa, and it's only in the upper middle income countries where the labor force has fallen in Africa. And it's only in those countries where we also see the fertility transition, the demographic transition, the movement away from a young society actually happening. Okay, so now taking the demographics that you saw and this starting point, where do we think Africans are going to work? Well, again, when I put this up some few years ago, again, this was a shocker. I think it is no longer a shocker, but it does show that almost 40% of the new jobs, shall we say, in this decade, are expected to come from agriculture. In low-income countries and resource-rich countries, that figure is even higher. And it is expected to remain high in the next decade as well, easily through 2030. So in a way, the debate yesterday about whether agriculture is the sector of opportunity is almost irrelevant. It has to be a sector of opportunity because given where we start, right, if we start here, we can't suddenly get rid of the labor force in agriculture, especially given this kind of growth. The numbers just don't add up. So Africa, indeed, is going to grow differently, and it's going to develop differently, and agriculture is going to be a part of it. Now, we have seen yesterday, in a way this slide may also be redundant, we have seen yesterday that agriculture is a sector of opportunity, not only for export crops, but also for domestic demand, and the urbanization that our previous speaker just spoke about means there's going to be a even higher demand for food. And I think what people may not really realize is that in other countries that have had an economic, social, and political transformation toward middle income status and eradicating extreme poverty, agriculture has been key. It has underpinned the productivity growth in other sectors. It's not a debate. And I guess we sort of found that out yesterday. All right, now, this slide also probably seems a little strange to you because yesterday you heard from three dynamic youth working in agriculture and making money. But I think we also heard, when we heard the diaries as well, about some people who struggled to make money in agriculture. And so while there are opportunities, if youth can't take advantage of those opportunities, they will not be happy. This takes the kind of private sector leadership we've seen here, but as we will talk about, it also takes some public sector leadership as well. The point I'd like to highlight the most here is the second to last point about getting access to land. There is no way that youth can be successful in agriculture if they can't get access to land. So we can't have rabbit farmers all over East Africa if you can't get access to land to raise and graze those rabbits. It just can't happen. In addition, we can't have food for the cities grown in Africa if the youth who could make it productive can't get access to the land and the credit they need to adopt the new technologies and make the productivity, get the productivity gains that Africa so desperately needs. Now, this slide comes from my colleague Tom Jane, and it comes from his research. And what he's highlighting here is that in some parts of sub-Saharan Africa, there are serious problems for youth in getting access to land because of large-scale land acquisitions. Now, those large-scale, there's been a lot of publicity around the large-scale land acquisitions that have happened by foreign companies or are trying to happen by foreign companies. But there, as this slide shows, there are also large-scale land acquisitions happening from domestic investors. Tom can talk more about this, but his research shows that these are actually often middle-class urban investors, often people who worked in the public sector and developed some savings or got some money from their Provident Fund or whatever and are investing in land. The problem is that youth in rural areas don't have that kind of money. And if the state, who is supposed to be the guardian of land rights for the whole nation, and or the traditional chiefs, who are supposed to be the guardian of land rights for their community, are not looking out for the interests of youth and young farmers, many of the innovations we've been talking here won't be able to take off. Okay, can these problems be solved? I think what we're going to talk about today is that governance, institutions, and markets are as important in agriculture and elsewhere, and that the state has a role to play. You know, the dynamism that we've seen from the private sector will eventually go flat if the state really works to stop it. And there's a lot of discussion about governance and institutions and markets in the non-farm sector, doing business, the investment climate, how long it takes to register a business, the tax rate, how many permits you have to get, et cetera, et cetera. All those are important in terms of urbanization and the growth of urban areas. But, you know, the investment climate in agriculture and who are winners, how the institutions work, how local government works, how national government works, how many people you have to bribe to get a land title, whether the state is in charge of marketing or the private sector. Does the private sector have a monopoly? Is that monopoly regulated? All of these things are super important in agriculture. I want to highlight, we've talked about land markets, and they're definitely key in both urban and rural areas. Logistics and transport costs, people don't actually realize why they're high in Africa. Been a lot of research that suggests that there's a lot of monopolies going on there, and those are basically earning monopoly profits. Again, policy. There's a role for policy and for government. We've talked a lot, I think, already about rural education and agricultural research. Cash transfers and mobile money are not only doing many of the things that were discussed by our previous speaker, but they also can break through some of the constraints in rural finance. And my last point is, don't forget about the gender issue. life is hard for young females in rural areas in Africa. They face many constraints. They're often pushed into early marriage. They bear children at too young of an age. That has health consequences. That has consequences for their education. Their economic opportunities are often more limited. We can't forget about the gender issue. Thank you very much.
And thank you, Louise, for presenting that general context very quickly, but hitting the key points. The absolute essential necessity of making jobs in agriculture for young people, because that's where young people are going to be. They're going to be earning their living there. And so how can we interact with the context in order to make it possible for them to earn good living? So the necessity, the fact that there are significant constraints there, but also a message that if we understand those constraints, we can act collectively to address them. So let's turn now to our panelists. We're divided here, but we can reach across the stage and go into a few of those constraints in a little bit more detail. And Saleh Ghariba, I'd like to start with you. I want to give you one of the tough ones. I'm sure that you're a diplomat because that's your profession. So let me ask you the really difficult one. One of the points that Louise had on her slide and that we've heard from about yesterday is the fact that there are traditions, a panoply of very different traditions and cultures across Africa, but in many respects, they privilege the elders. And we saw on Louise's slide that young people feel trapped in the countryside because they're within this cultural context and construct that privileges the elders. Now, I myself actually am quite sympathetic to respect for the elderly, given my stage in life. But I'd like to hear from you. What is your view about the cultural dimensions of constraints to creating opportunities for young people? And is this a constraint, and is it changing?
Thank you very much, Karen. I think it's a very important dimension of the whole mix of transformation. I'd like to borrow from one of Louise's statements in the slides that economic transformation is actually premised as well essentially on land use transformation. So access to land is a very, very important and critical factor. And certainly traditional practices have hindered to some extent, but to a large extent also served as part of the preservation device of land and arable land. The extent to which this is a constraint is changing, but not changing rapidly enough. It is to the extent that a lot of young people are having to escape rural areas, partly because of lack of access to land, but mainly because, as one of the case studies presented yesterday, the diminishing returns on the land that they have continued to work with their elders. So in that context, I think that as much as access to land is a difficulty, what is even more profound for the transformation of agriculture, and especially for access to agriculture by young people, is the extent to which that land, which they are working, is productive and continues to expand in its productivity. We heard of the case study where, in certain instances, an acre of land is producing 4 bags of maize, when in fact, its potential is 40 bags. So a fundamental factor is the extent to which traditional or even modern states are able to invest in the improvement of land and in the improvement of land management. And we have found quite consistently that where the state has worked with landholders, whether in trust or in full ownership, to improve the quality of land, such as put in irrigation, there has been a much more nuanced management and somewhat equitable access to that land insofar as the value has increased, and its management has in some ways been taken not entirely out of the hands of elders, but at least has been managed in the context of a particular purpose. I give 2 examples. In northern Ghana, the blend partnership between private sector and the state in investing in land for the purpose of growing trees rather than annual crops has almost completely changed the way in which land is managed, to the extent that there is greater access for women and men, and there is much more legal title to that extent. This is extending as well to areas where the state has intervened in improving access by providing roads and also irrigation facilities. When those things happen, not only does the quality of land improve, but also the management of that land tends to be mediated.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Saleh. You have emphasized the aspect of tradition and custom that relates to access to land, and it's tremendously important. In this conversation, we'll come back to that in just a few minutes. But I want to turn now to Irene. You are representing agricultural science and technology on this stage. We've heard yesterday, and we know, that young people do not want to go into a backward agriculture that their grandparents practiced. They want to go into agriculture which is modern, which is incorporating new technology and modern science. It may be on a small scale, but nonetheless, incorporating modern science. So can you tell us what is happening with agricultural science in Africa? What's the status now? What can we expect in the future? And what are we doing about it?
Thank you very much, Karen, and very pleased to be here. I think this is one of the basic questions that we need to look at in terms of how do we engage the youth through the application of science. On this continent, we are aware that the issues of applying science and development of technologies has actually come to help and provide benefits. But I don't think the continent has taken a lot of advantage of these potential benefits that science could bring. And I think the whole nexus between the use of science and engagement of the youth is the bigger conversation that this continent ought to look at. I know currently that there is a big wave of interest in, from the African Union right down to the countries in getting and leveraging what science can bring to agriculture, and therefore how do we engage the youth. There is an agenda, the African countries some countries have policies that we need to leverage and we need to deploy in order to get the young people as part and parcel of that deploying science for agriculture. And let me underpin that now we're talking about science for agriculture, not agriculture science, because I think we're seeing on the continent that there's enormity, big advantages of taking science in its wider perspective and bringing it to bear on agriculture. And I think that's where the youth equation comes in. We are currently also talking about commercializing technologies. And Karen, I think the youth are very important when it comes to that. And we're seeing impressive models that we could scale on this continent where the youth would take advantage of agribusiness through commercializing technologies. And also to underpin the fact that we are not just saying that technology is important, but we have concrete examples where technology has actually made impact on this continent. We just haven't taken advantage of that, and we have not made enough investments to ensure that science and technology is taken on board. For instance, and I'll give two examples. If we take rice, for instance, the Nerika rice success has brought in its wake almost being grown over 250,000 hectares. But now you go to countries in East Africa, you're looking for the seed, and you cannot find it. So I think what I'm trying to say is that the opportunities are there. We are not making enough investment to take advantage of the opportunities to apply the science that we have on the continent. And of course, in that week, we are not able to then engage the youth because the whole, as we heard the president of AGRA making a point this morning, the whole space between the youth and agriculture can be brought together if we are able to apply the necessary science. Not just the high-end science, but also the science that underpin our indigenous knowledge on African food systems. So there's quite a bit that's going on the continent to not just bring continental policies, but also let these policies drill down to country level and to affect local action, and to ensure that countries make their own investments and not just over-depend on external investment. Because over time, we know from figures that from 2000 to say 2011, there's been investment increase of about from 1.2 to 1.7 billion. But what does that mean? I mean, that investment has gone more in areas of maybe a few countries. On average, it's very little. And then the investment in even those countries have gone into, say, salaries, but not in actually the development of the science itself for us to take advantage of the power of science. Because we know there's no country in this world that has actually overcome its poverty status or food insecurity or nutritional insecurity without applying science. And Africa is not going to be different. So we need to really take advantage of the opportunity that we can make this happen. We need to put in the necessary policies. And again, I like the slide where Louise touches on all the different ramifications of the institutional bottlenecks that we need to overcome. We need to see how African governments can make the necessary investment that's commensurate to those shifts that need to be made. Because otherwise, the investments we are making too little, too late, and not at the appropriate time. And it's not going to really help us to make that difference in commercializing science to engage the youth, which is really, I think, at the heart of the issues that we're discussing.
Okay, thank you, Irene. We've heard a very strong statement that underinvestment in science for agriculture, I didn't say agricultural science, but science for agriculture in Africa, is a significant systemic constraint to bringing young people into agriculture and creating opportunities for them to work productively. So thank you for that. I want to stay on this topic for one more round with you, Irene, so you're not finished yet. On this stage, we have 3 agricultural scientists who are women. Actually, we have you outnumbered, gentlemen. Is that the situation in agricultural science in general in Africa? Do we have a great supply of women, or do we have gender issues in the cadre of agricultural scientists within Africa?
Thank you. Now, I'm happy that you raised this question. I think yesterday I was listening to Madame Lagarde on the issue of China's change in policy. Yeah. And she was talking about serious research and data that they have collected to show how the inequalities in gender is undermining the growth in African countries and, of course, in developing countries. And I thought that was a very big statement and serious statement, because she explained that it's been shown, and the data they've collected show that in areas where the gender gap has been closed, the GDPs of those countries have actually improved. Now, what does that tell us? Coming from a capacity development standpoint, I've always maintained that the gender or the inequities that we see in gender is actually a serious capacity issue. And until we deal with that, it's going to continue to undermine whatever we do. If we put all our investment on half the population, and if we increase the capacity of half the population, how are we expecting to take full advantage of what confronts Africa? So the inequalities in gender is general. But in science, it's worse. Yeah. It's worse. And the difficulty in getting not just women, but even the youth now to go into science is difficult because, you know, the question that my son will ask, the response my son will tell me when you say go and do a science subject or agriculture, he will just ask me, is that going to give me a lot of money? Simple. So that tells you that whatever we do, whether in science or in agriculture, it has to be stimulating enough and economically sound for the youth to get in. So the gender divide or the inequities that we are seeing in gender is a more profound area that we need to look at. It's not simply numbers, but it has more serious implication for the economies of our countries, not just because we have more women or less men, or more men and less women, but because we are not engaging our full potential. And how to unlock that potential, I think, comes with unlocking the potential of either side of the gender equation.
Okay. Thank you very much, Irene. I'm sure we'll want to come back to that in the discussion, but in order to leave time for that, I want to turn now and return to our land issues. Tom, you've done fascinating work recently to understand the changing structure of farming, access to land, and how that's changing in a number of African countries. It's really important because, of course, as agriculture becomes more dynamic, land use has to change. Land shifts. Some people who were farming leave farming. Other people enter. The size of farms changes as the technology changes. That's the story of agricultural development globally, and Africa is not going to be an exception to that. So we have to expect a lot of fluidity, a lot of change in patterns of land use. What are we seeing now on the ground?
Thanks, Louise and Karen. So let me distinguish between pull migration and push migration and what land has to do with that. So when things are working well and there's dynamism going on in the non-farm economy and so forth, that's able to pull people off the land and encourage structural transformation processes because people are having growing opportunities in the non-farm sector. When that's happening, people are voluntarily being, incentivized to come off the land and become more urbanized. And this is what we've seen in many Asian countries recently, and where things are going well. Now, by contrast, a push migration is when people are involuntarily displaced from their land, where land constraints and scarcity is arising such that people don't have opportunities in rural areas and they're pushed off of the land. And this is correlated with the rise of slums and the rise of people on the street corners in towns selling talk time and water. And this is not the kind of transformation that most of us want to see. So let me make a related point about this, which is that in the long run, we want to see this transformation where an increasing proportion of Africa's workforce and their youth are engaged in viable non-farm activities. But in order to get there, the transition to get there in the stage of development that most African countries are in, with 60 or 70% of the workforce engaged in agriculture, that the demand for these non-farm jobs you need the purchasing power there. And when you have 60, 70% of the population primarily engaged in farming, that's where the demand is going to come from to ignite the demand for non-farm goods and services. So as we've seen in many other parts of the world, when the transformation is working well, the kind of non-farm jobs that arise first are the ones that farmers are purchasing. So, when farmers get more money in their hands, what is it that they buy? They'll buy, corrugated iron roofing sheets and bricks and clothing and, hairdressing. And this is where, veterinary services for their animals, processed goods, this is where you see how the non-farm economy starts to grow at first. And as it, transitions further and further, this is what pulls people off the farm into, into non-farm. So I think that I'm still trying to wrap my mind around the results of this poll yesterday, where, in the beginning, most of the people felt that, at least the results of the electronic poll were that most people felt agriculture wasn't going to be the primary sector. And in many African countries where 60-70% of the workforce are right now engaged in agriculture, I can't see how that transition is going to occur unless the 60 or 70% have a lot more money in their hands in order to provide the purchasing power that will now open up the jobs in the non-farm sector. So I'd like to echo the points of the previous two speakers that access to land is crucial for that, and so is improved science and technology and extension systems to empower that 60 or 70% to be productive and to get more purchasing power in their hands.
Okay, thanks, Tom. You've given us a very quick and I think very concise overview of how land use changes with what we call rural transformation as rural areas change, and agriculture has a major role in that. We get more mixed livelihoods, which we've heard about over the last few days. We get increased demand for things that are not food, and so you have labor moving into other activities to respond to that demand. You've given us a very concise statement about how that all works. You kind of dodged the question about how young people get access to land. And so I want to come back to the issue that Sully put very squarely on the table for us. Is there something about the legal environment, about the traditional customs? What is it that is affecting the intergenerational transfer of land? Because that's what really matters to young people, that they can, at a relatively early stage, maybe not 18, but certainly before they're 55, that they can get access to land, and preferably something more than 1 acre, 1 hectare, something, an amount of land that they can work with modern methods that is going to give them a livelihood, maybe not solely based on agriculture, but enough earnings that can be competitive with what's happening in the other sectors. So how do they get that land?
Okay, all right, Karen, thanks for bringing me back to it. Okay, so people are living longer, and as people live longer, they're less willing to part with their land before they're willing to part with their land. So young people are having to wait a little bit longer to be granted access to land. Also, population growth. Rural population growth is still clicking along. There's going to be 53% more people in rural Africa in 2046 than there are today. So even though Africa is urbanizing, its rural population growth is still going up fairly dramatically in some areas. As population density increases in rural Africa, there are many parts of Africa that do not have more land to allocate. And so when a parent may have 4 children, let's say, and that family may have 1.5 hectares of land, so when those 4 children grow up and get into their 20s, how are they going to divide that 1.5 hectares across 4 different people? It just won't happen. So this is an example of push migration that I was referring to earlier. Maybe 1 or 2 people of the children may end up working that land, and the remainder are not going to have access to land. They're going to have to rent land or buy land through the land market, and this is a very difficult way to start out. There was a statistic in Kenya that I thought was really important, that 25% of young people in Kenya, rural young people in Kenya, do not inherit any land anymore. So this used to be something that was regarded as a birthright for most Africans that were born in rural areas. You would get access to that land. Now, as land markets start to develop, and as Louise put on the board there's increasing investors coming in land and investing in land. Many of them are urban-based people. As that happens, this sort of creates something like an enclosures movement. The African enclosures movement is starting to happen and be observable in certain parts, densely populated parts of the region. And so this really does exacerbate access to land by young people. You know, Africa, much of Africa has two tenure systems. There's the customary tenure areas, which are controlled by traditional authorities. And then there's the statutory state land, which is usually there's title deeds associated with this, and this land can be bought and sold. So most rural youth right now who are growing up in rural areas are dependent on land from the customary areas in order for them to access land, you know, in the future. And as more of that customary land starts to be allocated to other interests, which is happening at an unknown but sometimes rapid pace, the data on this is not very good, so we don't know the rate at which this is happening, but anecdotally, it appears to be quite rapid. Where that's happening, this is creating problems for the next generation of rural people to access land. And it's contributing to this push migration out of rural areas that we're seeing in many places in the region. So it's a challenge.
Okay, thank you, Tom. Thanks for being willing to come back to that very fraught issue. It's a politically very difficult issue, but in terms of the issues that condition the opportunities for young people, it's a really important one, this whole question of access to land and particularly the intergenerational issues around that. So we've heard about science, we've heard about tradition, we've heard about land issues. Louise, you've been listening. Are there any points that you would like to, had I asked any of those questions to you, would you have had different perspectives than our panelists here? Anything you'd like to add before we open it to the group?
I think I'd just like to come back to the point of the role of the state and policies matter. I mean, Tom was just talking about land and transparency. Irene was talking about science. Suli was talking about the role of the state in mediating some of these land conflicts. And I guess the question in my mind is, how does the energy that we've seen in terms of young people on the private sector trying to make agricultural work, trying to make labor more productive, trying to raise output and earnings and have people have a better livelihood, how does that translate into advocacy for better policies? About 2 years ago, there was a lot of discussion about hippos and lions, I remember. Or maybe it was 3 years ago, hippos and lions. And there's no question, we saw it yesterday, and at this conference, many of the young people that I've met here are roaring lions full of energy, and I love it. But my question is, have young lions sort of given up on the hippos? And I understand why, but is a fully kind of, let's return to the private sector, let's just get things done on our own, will that kind of strategy work? How does rural collective action work effectively for youth in the transformation of agriculture in Africa, and the needed transformation of agriculture in Africa? I think that's the question I'm still stuck with. And maybe it's the question we start the questions with. I don't know.
Okay. I think Sole has the answer before we turn to the audience for an answer.
I'd like to have one too.
No, I just thought that's quite a profound question because, you know, I worked for a number of years until only a few months ago in the president's office in policy making. And one of the incredible difficulties for policies related to youth is the segmentation of the policy process. We're structured as ministries, departments, and agencies. And curiously, for many of our countries, youth in my country is buried in sports. It's Ministry of Youth and Sports. And therefore, the most substantive sectors that have incredible dividends for this problematic of youth employment in agriculture, in industry, and science and technology tends to be relegated to the banner. Happily, as we noted from yesterday's presentation by the Deputy Minister and the Office of the President in South Africa, that the young lions, as Louise characterized youth, are becoming far more active beyond individualism. I mean, enterprise and innovation may happen at the individual level, but we're seeing incredible collective action, advocacy by youth. And in South Africa, a couple of weeks ago, the hashtag fees must drop was just a smokescreen for much more profound demand for youth employment. And what the minister did characterize for us is that for the first time, the youth movement, collective action around fees, has galvanized a different permutation of government decision-making. No less than 5 major ministries had to sit together just to respond to the youth demand, which turns out to be a complete reform of education policy, which has a lot to do with a call on the private sector to mobilize the reserves that they have and they are holding in assets to come and partner with government in recreating a different mix of education that is oriented towards employable youth. So in some ways, the public policy process had been left to ossify in some bureaucratic silos. But youth energy and youth activism, more collective action, is prying open this. And therefore, when I see youth being agitated, first of all, about the failure of public policy, but are proactive in the manner in which they're shaping what they see to be the future, I think governments will have to start to listen. And this is happening even more so in countries that are democratic, that have space for decision-making, but youth have not been listened to for a long time. And the results are what we're seeing with collective action.
Okay, thank you, Solly. I think you have given a good kind of wrap-up. Not that I'm going to close this session yet, because we have lots of opportunity to interact with the audience, but you've given us a very good statement about why this session is so important, because we've identified a number of systemic constraints to creating good opportunities for young people, and yet those systemic constraints show up as part of a necessary public sector agenda, but they're not all in one place within the public sector. And so it becomes very difficult for political leaders to both understand what has to be done, how it has to be coordinated, and perhaps that's part of the problem that a summit like this has to highlight and flag and put out in the public space, so that there's recognition that it really is important to address these issues, and that the political and bureaucratic structures that we have are not necessarily very well constructed in order to do that. So with that, let me hear from the audience. Questions, comments, observations? I expect that we have lots out here. I can't see the hands too well.
There's one back there.
Okay. And can you please identify yourself and then state your question or comment quite briefly, please?
Yes, my name is Kinyua Mbijiwe from Syngenta. I have a question for Dr. Irene. In your closing statement, you mentioned the challenge of the commercialization of research and development. Companies are good at doing commercialization. Research institutions are good at research. Do you think there are enough incentives in the research organizations, or the right mechanisms like contracts, or the right awareness from companies of the outcomes of your research? And is there a way to improve the connectivity between commercial companies with the opportunities that research has? And if so, how could we improve that?
Thank you very much. A question very close to my own heart. I think we had one in the back. Let's take 3, and then we'll turn to the panel.
Hi, it's Craig Hardy from Malawi Mangoes. I've got a question for the panel, but firstly, the comment is lots of talk about creating opportunities on the supply side. It's about land access, technology, such things as irrigation, the science, which is all obviously critical. And there was a mention of, but it needs to make money. So my concern, there was no mention of the market. We need to look at both sides of the coin. And in fact, many programs have failed because exactly that point, they look at the supply side only, and the market is an afterthought. So my question, what is the panel's view of the best way to link youth or smallholders into reliable formal markets of scale?
Okay, thank you. Question and remark.
Hello, my name is Esther Mudhoni. I'm from Kenya. I lead an organization called Economic Projects Transformational Facility, involved with enterprise, helping youths to think about how to create enterprises instead of looking for jobs, that they can create the jobs themselves. I have a few questions or just observations or things that I'm reflecting on and I'm wondering about. Whether we are not starting to climb the tree from the top. In looking at the investments that has gone on in terms of the education, when I was growing up, I grew up in the rural areas. We grew up, our parents educated us through the land, but they told us you have to go out and look for jobs, and they helped us to think of going away. And so we went away and looked for jobs and did whatever we did. But now we are looking at the land as a solution. So my question is, shouldn't we be doing a more concerted effort at transforming the education system from the roots, so that as people go to even kindergarten, as they go to primary school, to secondary school, to high school, they are already thinking these things. And so by the time they leave in school, they think agriculture is a solution to a lot of their challenges. It's very hard to change someone who has grown thinking that agriculture is not the solution. You're changing them now when they are already too old. Yeah, so those are some of my comments. The other question I had is the effect of terrorism. When I think about the northern Nigeria and how many people are being displaced by terrorism in Kenya, that has also, some places there is that effect in all that. What does that mean for agriculture?
Well, let's take them in order. Let's go first to the one about the relation between the public and the private sector in agricultural research. Irene, I would
Yes. I think this is a very important question. I think yesterday we were alluding to the intricacies between public-private relationships and agreements. And when I mentioned commercialization of technologies, that was the issue underpinning that. But also to mention that we are currently having or emerging models that should help us to bring to the fore the so-called mistrust between the public and private sectors, because that is what is worrying a lot of the issues about scaling to get impact. We are very much aware that if we're looking for investment, but huge enough investment to make the impact, it's the public sector that should actually act, and it's the public sector that should leverage enough investment, at least at country level, to stimulate private sector engagement. But the current institutional arrangement is not very conducive to making that happen. And so we're having models that work in pockets, but is not able to get translated at the national level big enough to create the impact that technology could potentially have. We have models, yesterday we talked about incubation, where we have young people at the time of their prime, very innovative, coming into agribusiness, taking advantage of technologies. We have research institutions that have inventorized lots of technologies that could be commercialized. But where are the policies that will support them to take advantage at the country level of these technologies and to take advantage of the innovative capacity of the youth within the countries? So it is an important conversation that we must have to ensure that we have those contract agreements between public-private relationship to unlock some of these potential opportunities being presented by science and technology.
I would simply add, from my perspective, within the CGIAR system, we're very concerned about this interface between public agricultural research and private research, because that has to work well in order for the enterprise collectively to succeed. And so we're working on that, trying to find good mechanisms for relationships between the two types of research. It's not easy, but it can be done, and I think we're making progress. But there's another dimension which is very important, which is the contribution that we as researchers and scientists can make to understanding the policy environment, which makes it more possible for the private agricultural research and technology firms to function successfully. And that's issues about seed policy, issues about the introduction of new technologies, the regulatory environment. Those are things where we can weigh in and also be helpful, and we're trying to do that. Now, it's my job to watch the time, so I'm trying to do that. And I want us to make sure that we can address this question. Did we really forget the market? Do we not think about markets? I'm sure all of us have quite a bit to say about whether we have forgotten the markets.
Yeah, maybe let me take a quick stab at that issue. The bad news over the last decade has been quite a large volume of imported food in relation to a dramatic growth in the African middle class. The good news today is that there is quite a substantive market for food, but especially not just farm food alone, but food that is related to the entire agricultural value chain. Processing, roasted corn into cornflakes, processed kinds of foods which appeal especially to a middle class that can now afford. And so the market is important, it still needs to be nurtured, but actually supply side difficulties and bottlenecks are making it difficult to penetrate the market which actually exists. Many of our countries are in partial financial crisis because of our trade imbalances associated with, guess what? The massive importation of food. And part of the opportunities that youth are taking advantage of now, some of the success stories we had in this conference, has to do with young people beginning to perceive this large market, middle-class market, that is, by the way, growing. And the food that is imported increasingly is outside the reach of ordinary citizens. And therefore, local production, accelerated processing, and other packaging improvements, especially by young people, is starting to get a significant market niche. In Ghana, literally everything you produce will find an instant market.
Okay, thank you. Tom, I know that you've just spent a lot of time looking precisely at the functioning of markets, particularly the linkage between urbanization and marketing in Tanzania. Any very quick reactions that you want to share with us?
Thanks, Karen. So I think we all agree that markets are clearly important. It strikes me that policy is at the root of this. That because of all the reasons that he just mentioned, the demand is there. Africa's demand is outstripping its production right now, its ability to feed that demand. That's why imports are coming in. I think 96% or 94% of all of the food imports into Africa right now are coming from outside the continent, which is a travesty. And only 6% is regional trade. When you look around the borders, there's this curious phenomenon of people bicycling back and forth, one bag of maize, one bag of something at a time. Bicycle traders. Why is that happening? Well, it's happening because of policy restrictions on trade, but cross-border trade from one country to the other. So I think some of you guys know about this. You're allowed to export one bag at a time across these borders, but anything like a truckload, the truck lines up, comes up to the border, then they offload one bag at a time, and then there's another truck on the other side of the border that aggregates back up and then goes off to the capital city. This just destroys the competitiveness of African producers to export to their neighbors. It's a huge missed opportunity. So So I'd just like to leave this for the whole conference, I think that that policy and the role of government is decisive. Yes, the private sector will be the engine of growth for agriculture and non-farm. The private sector will be crucial for this, but the scope for private sector to really provide these gains is going to be constrained or enabled by what government policy does. In agriculture right now, many ministries of agriculture devote 50 or 60% of their entire budget to things like marketing boards and input subsidy programs and so forth. And the public sector investment in R&D and crop science is minimal. In extension systems, almost defunct in many countries. We need a lot more public sector policies that will help promote the private sector's ability to invest and catalyze economic growth rather than constrain it. And that's something that I feel that all of us that are concerned with youth employment, we need to deal much more effectively with government. Because many government officials are afraid of the private sector. They're afraid of the relinquishing of control of what the private sector may do, and we need to help guide them along with all of you, all of the private sector people, NGOs, to work with governments to help them see how they can promote the interests and livelihoods of youth and population at large in a way that's not going to have them lose control of the situation.
Okay, thank you, Tom. We're running very close to the end of our session, but I can't pass up this wonderful question about climbing the tree from the top down. I hadn't actually heard that one before. But in relation to the educational system and the needed reforms, I want to turn to Louise to give us a few insights in that. But I also want to just note, I sat in on a very interesting side group discussion yesterday that really was focusing on the skills agenda and the education and the need for reform in education. So it came out very clearly there. But Louise, maybe give us a few comments on that?
That's right. I would echo Karen's point that I'll do a little commercial for the demand-driven skills breakout group next time. It discussed it a lot. So when I was doing this work on youth employment, I was working at the World Bank and doing it with a colleague by the name of Dion Filmer, who does a lot of work on education in Africa. And throughout this discussion, we had this ongoing discussion. And I would say, Dion, most youth in Africa are going to have to make their own job. And they don't know that. They leave primary school, they leave secondary school, either graduates or not graduates, even university, without knowing that, without having any idea of how people make their own jobs, and start a business or start working in agriculture or whatever. And why can't the education system do more of that? Why in other regions does the education system do more of that and not in Africa? And Dion would look at me very somberly and say, Louise, the education system is not even teaching people to read, write, add, and subtract. How can we burden it with that? However, I have to say that at the end of a year and a half or so of working together, we did come to an understanding, which is that there needs to be an education reform in Africa. Yes, the education system has to start teaching people to read, write, add, and subtract in primary school, but it also has to focus on soft skill, what we call soft skills development, or life skills, or employability skills. It has to give them an understanding, and their parents, by the way, an understanding of what is the labor market they're going to enter into. So I would say that the challenge is huge, but we have to climb the tree almost from the top and the bottom to meet in the middle. Some of us have to worry about whether the agriculture sector or other parts of the non-farm sector that youth are going to enter into actually provide enough opportunities for them to make a sustainable livelihood and support themselves and their families. And other of us have to worry about the development of those youth within the educational system and within the communities so that they have the employability skills that they need to take advantage of their opportunities.
Okay, well, I think, Irene, you want to come in with
Just
2
one-
words.
1 point to add to the education issue of climbing the tree from the top. I think also some of our own studies and understanding for reform is that education in Africa, starting from primary school, does not begin to apply what is taught. It is never contextualized.
Right.
And this is part of climbing the tree from the bottom, because if children are not even starting to learn about agriculture, surely when they are taught, the context can quickly be given right from the beginning and work their way up. So what is really creating the problem is not actually contextualizing what we're teaching. And we are not contextualizing because, Karen, we don't have the data. We don't have the information, which is contextual.
And Sully, you also want to come in.
Just wrapping up, I think the analogy of climbing the tree from the top is quite apt, because what I've learned from young people these last couple of days is that young people have climbed the tree, they've seen a broader vision, and they're now climbing down and digging into the roots to make agriculture work. And I think that it's an apt description.
And are they growing rabbits around the roots? Is that?
Absolutely.
Okay, well, I think our excellent panel has actually done the job for me. I don't really need to sum up the discussion that we've had. It's been very rich, very rapid, fast-paced. But I really want to thank the organizers for giving us an opportunity to give this focus to the systemic picture, because we really need that understanding of the context in which young people have to make their way and what has to happen on the part of public officials, the keepers of the main institutions, what kinds of changes have to take place at society and political level in order to ease the road for these very talented young people so that more of the young people can do the kinds of wonderful things that we heard about yesterday that some are able to do now. And again, let's come back to our 10, 11, even a larger number of millions of young people who are going to be facing these challenges every year. So there's lots that can be done. Some of it is being done, but much more of it has to be done much faster so that those young people have an easier road ahead. So thank you very much for your attention, your participation, and I look forward to the rest of the summit.
That was excellent.